There are secrets governments deny. There are secrets they classify. And then there are secrets that are quietly erased before anyone is meant to know they ever existed. Most people assume intelligence records fall into two categories: classified and declassified. That belief is convenient. It suggests a clean process, controlled timelines, and eventual transparency. But inside intelligence institutions, this idea is understood to be incomplete. There is a third category of records: files that were never meant to survive long enough to be classified at all. These are not the famous leaks or carefully staged declassifications released decades later. These are working documents, internal notes, draft assessments, operational communications written with the assumption that they would be destroyed once their immediate purpose was served. They were not written for historians. They were not written for lawyers. They were written for speed, clarity, and internal coordination. Every covert operation produces paperwork. Before it begins, there are risk assessments, legal interpretations, and strategic justifications. During execution, there are field updates, contingency reports, and internal briefings. Afterward, there are evaluations, damage assessments, and lessons learned. Even operations described publicly as off the books require documentation somewhere. Someone must authorize funding. Someone must interpret legality. Someone must assess outcomes. The more sensitive the operation, the greater the internal need for explanation. Secrecy does not eliminate records. It multiplies them. During the 20th century, intelligence agencies expanded faster than their ability to control their own archives. Departments were created, dissolved, and restructured. Classification systems changed. Physical files were moved. Digital systems replaced paper, then were replaced again. In this constant transition, documents slipped out of their intended life cycle. Some were marked for destruction, but never destroyed. Some were misfiled under vague or deliberately misleading titles. Others were summarized, copied, or referenced elsewhere, leaving traces even after the originals were gone. Over time, these fragments accumulated, not as an organized archive, but as anomalies. Files without a clear owner. References without context. Records that quietly contradicted the official narrative. They were not preserved out of courage or defiance. They survived because no one believed they mattered anymore. Inside intelligence communities, not all records are treated equally. Some files are created with the understanding that they will eventually be reviewed, sanitized, and released. Others are created with the assumption that they will disappear. Among archivists and analysts, there is an informal term for these records: ghost files. Ghost files are documents that reference real operations, real methods, and real decisions, but exist outside official registries. They may be stored in archives or databases, but lack the metadata that would normally anchor them inside the system. They are present, but officially invisible. These files often surface by accident. An analyst researching one operation stumbles across a memo referencing another that does not exist in the historical record. A budget review reveals funding allocations with no corresponding mission. An archivist discovers a sealed box that has been transferred across decades without ever being opened. What makes ghost files dangerous is not just their content, but what their existence implies. They suggest that certain actions were not rare exceptions, but recurring practices. That methods described publicly as extraordinary were, internally, routine. that policies framed as temporary measures were embedded more deeply than anyone was willing to admit. Because these documents were never intended to survive, they often lack the careful legal language found in files prepared for oversight. They are blunt, direct, written for colleagues who shared assumptions about legality, necessity, and acceptable risk. They reveal how intelligence officers spoke when they believed no one outside the institution would ever read their words. In some cases, ghost files describe techniques that were only acknowledged publicly years later. In others, they reference assets, operations, or foreign partnerships that remain sensitive long after the geopolitical landscape has changed. Individually, these files can be dismissed as anomalies. Collectively, they reveal something far more uncomfortable. They show continuity, not accidents, not rogue actors, but systems operating according to internal logic, largely insulated from public scrutiny. This is why such files are rarely confronted directly. To acknowledge them would be to acknowledge that certain behaviors were not mistakes, they were policy. Popular culture often portrays the survival of secret documents as the result of dramatic whistleblowers or acts of moral rebellion. In reality, most forbidden files survived for a far less heroic reason: bureaucracy. Destroying a document requires authorization. Someone must issue an order. Someone must confirm it was carried out. Someone must accept responsibility if questions are asked later. Ignoring a document requires nothing. Across multiple intelligence services, internal audits repeatedly identified records that fell outside established archival frameworks. These files were flagged as inconsistencies, anomalies, or administrative errors. In many cases, the warnings were acknowledged and then quietly set aside. No one wanted to authorize destruction without explicit guidance. No one wanted to preserve material that might later become a liability. And so the files were left untouched. Time did the rest. As years passed, urgency faded. The operations were no longer active. Political risks became harder to define. The people involved retired, transferred, or died. Each new generation of administrators assumed the issue had already been handled, that this transformed forbidden files into institutional orphans. In some cases, fragments surfaced through partial declassification. Lines were left unredacted because reviewers did not recognize their significance. In others, files were released in bulk, buried among thousands of pages, their implications invisible to anyone not specifically looking for them. The danger of these documents is not immediate scandal. It is accumulation. One file can be dismissed. Several can be ignored. But when assembled, they reveal patterns, doctrines, long-term strategies that were never meant to be examined as a whole. This is why access remains restricted, not because the truth would shock the public, but because it would explain the present too clearly. Every intelligence institution operates on the assumption that it controls its own history. In reality, history is far less cooperative. No system designed to record information can ever fully erase itself. Archives migrate, formats decay, context fades, but traces remain. A document copied too many times, a memo summarized instead of destroyed, a reference preserved in a place no one thought to check. The most sensitive records are rarely the ones aggressively classified or loudly denied. Those attract attention. They trigger oversight. They invite curiosity. The truly dangerous files are the ones quietly ignored. Too inconvenient to release, too risky to destroy, too obscure to justify intervention. These documents exist in a state of suspension, not alive enough to matter, not dead enough to disappear. Over time, they accumulate. A line item without explanation, a reference to an operation that officially never occurred, a justification memo written for an audience that no longer exists. Individually, they appear meaningless. Together, they form patterns that are difficult to dismiss. This is where institutional memory becomes a liability. Because institutions forget selectively. Personnel rotate, administrations change, priorities shift. Each generation inherits fragments without context and assumes the past was handled responsibly. The archive, however, does not make assumptions. It preserves inconsistencies alongside official narratives, waiting for someone capable of recognizing the difference. As legal frameworks evolve, actions once considered unthinkable become reframed as historically contextual. What was once illegal becomes ambiguous. What was once denied becomes partially acknowledged. And with each shift, the archive becomes harder to contain, not because it reveals individual crimes, but because it exposes continuity. These files do not accuse. They demonstrate. They show that certain methods were not improvisations, but refinements. That certain outcomes were not accidents, but foreseeable consequences. That institutional failure is rarely sudden. It is incremental, documented, and rationalized in real time. This is why intelligence services resist holistic examination of their own records. Not because the truth is explosive, but because it is explanatory. It reveals how power behaves when shielded from scrutiny and how systems persist long after their original justifications collapse. Somewhere, in a warehouse, a regional archive, or an aging digital system, the record remains intact enough to matter. Not as a complete story, but as evidence that the official version is incomplete. The files that were never meant to exist rarely change history overnight. Their influence is slower, more corrosive. They alter how the past is understood. They force uncomfortable questions. They reveal that what was presented as oversight was often choreography. People forget. Institutions adapt their narratives. Officials move on. The archive does not. It waits, and eventually, it outlives the secrecy that created it.